So let's start to work with the 4 mechanisms as a diagnostic tool, whereby whoever it is that you're seeing, you can begin to notice what's being disturbed, what is the mechanism that's happening, to begin to help them to see that it's within the realms of what I'm going to call the big picture normal, even though in the little picture it looks like the worst thing that's happening in the world. And the way to do that is to begin to understand that each of these mechanisms, as you can see, are part of the developmental stage of how we grow up. The key here, if we're starting off with the first mechanism, which is child mechanism, is to understand that key difference in human species, which is that we're not born ready to go. We're not popping out, ready to walk, ready to chew grass or eat whatever like animals are. We are extremely dependent for an extremely long period of time. And if there's just mum and dad and us out in the desert and mum and dad die, we die. So we have autonomic systems to maximize the likelihood of us getting into the next moment of evolution. So I'm going to very simplify different brains, and I'm just going to call them old brain and new brain. It doesn't mean they're the only ones, and it doesn't mean this is an exact science. It's just enough for anybody to know about in order to work with it. So old brain is reptilian brain, which is the fight-flight mechanism. New brain is the neocortex, which is all the stuff that Neanderthals weren't doing, which is abstract thought, music, humour, philosophy, self-reflection. So where this stuff becomes really useful is how they interact, because we've got both. And we're not exactly Neanderthals, and we're not exactly the most advanced version of ourselves either. And there's an importance and a primacy to keeping alive so that we don't get too philosophical and fall off the edge of a cliff. That reptilian brain has to kind of keep us in line to keep us alive. And where this becomes really important when you're understanding a client and their process is to understand how that starts off in the dependent stage of childhood. So in the dependent stage of childhood, the child has a fight-flight mechanism, which is meant to get them away from harm and attack something that's trying to hurt it, kill it. The only thing is that the child is completely dependent on their life support systems called mum and dad or carers. And that creates all sorts of, let's just call them dualities or dilemmas between reptilian brain and neocortex. Neocortex is the desire to just express yourself as you are, which is all well and good until you're playing hopscotch on the highway and mum and dad go, we don't think that's a good idea, and maybe they're not doing that in the nicest possible way, and they're frightening the kid into compliance using what I'm going to call things on the continuum of verbal and physical intimidation in order to gain compliance, which is very well intended to try to save the kid's life and is sometimes on a bad day insensitive in terms of methods. Call that voice raising, name calling, put down, threats, implied threats, all stuff that frightens the kid. Then there's an interplay between new brain and old brain. So we're going to look at exactly how that happens. Child mechanism, as you can see, is internal override. So now we're going to use the cards to show exactly how that happens in order to get some case studies of exactly how these mechanisms work, so that later on we'll be using some examples, and you can be thinking about, you probably want 3 examples of each that you can think of where you go, oh yes, I can think of examples where you've got each of those things happening. Oh yes, I acted out there. Oh yes, there was some inner criticism there. And you can be thinking about this while I'm talking to go, okay, what are some examples of that in my life? Because later on we're going to work with exactly those examples to go from that disturbance to what the healing is trying to happen, to how to intervene effectively internally and notice, oh, not only do I understand that, but I know how to deal with it. And I want to make a disclaimer about that. Healing in a conflict doesn't get rid of anything because it's all part of the whole. If you're born in France, you might end up with a French accent your whole life, no matter what country you live in. And that's just the flavour of this lifetime. But you can learn a different language, and that means that you can say, can you give me a croissant, and get one in Australia that you might not get if you're saying it in French. What I'm trying to say by this is we are likely to always get triggered by stuff we've been trained with. What healing in a conflict offers you the ability to do is to take the bullet out of the gun, so that what you hear is a click, which is much easier to deal with than a bang. So what will happen is you'll go from getting triggered 100% of the time to maybe getting triggered 5 or 10% of the time. And the intensity of how that goes over your body and makes you do stuff or not do stuff that's very consequential for you in relationship goes down to about 5 or 10%. It doesn't disappear. So I just want to make that clear. So let's start on child mechanism and the dependent stage of childhood. So we're going to work with the floor card template that has 8 cards. I'll sometimes work with it here and I'll sometimes work with it here. The reason for the floor cards is because we have many parts. Now this is just exactly the same as our body. We have a left hand and a right hand and a left leg and a right leg. The left hand is not all of us, it is part of us, and we call it a left hand because it does things differently to the right hand. This is nothing mysterious or mystical, but somehow, culturally, there's this tendency that as soon as you start talking about parts inside the internal consequential realm, it's like, oh, now we're talking crazy stuff. And this is literally, we're just going to nail it down to left hand, right hand. Which part's doing what, with which other part, for what reason, in what context. Don't feel like you need to understand that now, but by the end of the masterclass, you will absolutely know what that means. And you'll know it experientially, not just abstractly from the theory. You'll know it because you will have worked your own disturbances from a disturbance to what's going on, to understanding, to compassion, and to internal intervention. And the benchmark, which is where you actually feel different and you're able to respond differently when you're triggered. Because without that, it's not much use. So this stuff has to be benchmarkable. So the child mechanism is going to start from the expressive card because that's how children start. They start off and they're just expressing themselves going dum-de-doo, I'm going to make lots of noise and I'm going to put this lipstick on the wall because I like the colour. And that's going to be fine until some training happens. When mum or dad or the carer on a bad day, sleep deprived, goes, "Not my favourite lipstick, don't do that." And of course what's going to happen is the infant, who's in the dependent stage of childhood, is going to cry. There's going to be sadness. There's going to be tears. There's going to be, "Oh no, I thought you loved me. What's happened?" Which is inevitable. That's new brain. Then it's going to interact with old brain, because there's going to be a part whose job it is to make sure this, which looks like it's not getting good feedback from life support system, bad idea from getting into the next moment of evolution. So what happens is the parent is doing an acting out, an adolescent mechanism, probably because that's how they were trained. Not even probably. It's literally shit in, shit out. But there's a process of shit in, shit further in before that. And we're doing the shit in, shit further in. So, the parent's doing an adolescent mechanism and acting out, and of course, it's a fight mechanism. It's an attack, not a run away. So of course, which part inside the child mimics that? The fight mechanism. What do we remember? Anger is of course the battery pack for the fight mechanism. Fear is the battery pack for the flight mechanism. And at this point in time, it's probably useful to explain that, of course, when we started off, we only had the flight mechanism because we were amoebas before we were humans. And so we could only run away. And then as soon as we kind of got further up the food chain, we could take on other things that were attacking us. Why that's important is because underneath every fight mechanism is a flight mechanism, is a fear. In other words, this part's only going to do stuff because it's frightened something's going to happen, like you're going to kill me. Not a good idea. So just important to understand that. And while we're talking about child mechanism, important to understand that when it comes to the 4 mechanisms, you actually get 4 for the price of 1. Adolescent, adult, and self-distraction mechanisms are all variations on the child mechanism theme. These are your entry points from a diagnostic point of view, because someone's going to come in doing something that looks like an addiction, doing something that looks like passive aggression, doing something that looks like acting out. That's going to take you to what trained that, which is going to be child mechanism. Knowing that ahead of time is really useful. The whole point of healing in a conflict is to be able to take what looks like a big mess in terms of jigsaw puzzle pieces on the table and gives you the ability to put them together really simply because you've got handrails. You're literally just doing a how do we join the dots. And the same is true relative to fight and flight, anger and fear. Fear is always underneath anger. Why is the parent going, "Don't put that on the wall"? They're frightened of what they're going to have to do, what someone's going to think of them in terms of are they, being a good parent, their sense of themselves, their sense of how they want things to be, their sense of how they want the child to be. That's why a part goes, we've got to get you to change. So let's go back to the parent using voice raising to frighten the child, hopefully into compliance. The child cries, experiences the sadness, but it's not the only thing that they're experiencing. The next thing that has to happen, that they would get into the next moment of evolution, is that their fight part has to internalize that, mimic it, and go from vigilance to hypervigilance. Vigilance is when it's happening. Hypervigilance is when it's going to happen every time after that, so that the next time the child wants to make a lot of noise or put some lipstick on the wall, there's already a part inside going, don't put the lipstick on the wall, don't make so much noise. And it's kind of like, I'm going to criticize you in order to protect you from getting criticized, which is essential to get into the next moment of evolution, because what's the fear? Well, what if she doesn't feed me tomorrow? What if she abandons me because of this? Now, the infant's not thinking this. This is not cognitive. This is the equivalent of a knee-jerk response. It's also the equivalent of hypothermia, where you don't get to control which fingers are going to turn black and fall off so that your organs stay okay. This is stuff that your mind's not going to be able to do. It's like your breathing and your heartbeat. But what we're going to be able to do is go from, for example, breathing automatically as we are now, and I could just ask you now to hold your breath for 3 seconds. And then breathe normal again. You just took an automatic thing that you weren't thinking about and started to do it manually. That's called manual override. My mind's going, why are we doing this? But I can do it anyway. And then you can do it with your whole body. Let's jump. Okay, full body manual override. And we're literally going to learn how to do this in terms of changing behaviors. So, the internalization of that training in order to avoid abuse, neglect, being killed, being abandoned, anything that looks like it's not going to get us into the next moment of evolution. So what happens is a trilogy of things. One part that mimics the parent or the carer overrides that expression the next time into, don't put the lipstick on the wall, don't make so much noise. Overrides it into fearful paralysis. Don't do that. And pops out a body that goes, no, I like being quiet, Mummy. I don't want to put lipstick on the wall anymore. Which gets the pat on the head. The problem is, of course, later on, that person's going to have trouble when they want to make a lot of noise as an adult. And they're going to come to you and say, as a dissociated adult, oh, I just don't seem to be able to express myself. Everyone else seems to be able to talk at the party, but I just don't seem to be able to, say stuff. And that's their present moment disturbance. And you're going to narrow it down to one moment in time, because of course there are going to have been many. And we're going to go looking for the moment in time, how they got trained, and we know what it is because we just did that example. Later on, we're going to talk about all the dissociative mechanisms that they're going to find that are on the way, not in the way. Dissociation is not a dysfunction, it's a function. But you have to understand it as such. Otherwise, it just looks like a mess, something that shouldn't be there. Because you're going to ask this client, oh, and so, do you remember a time where anything happened? And they'll go, no, nothing. My parents were saints. I go, no. And it's a bit like the wide-mouthed frog joke. It's like, oh, you don't see many of those here, do you? And you're going to have to go through whatever dissociative mechanisms, like I don't remember. Oh, yes, they did it all the time. And you say, oh, well, can we think of one example? Oh, no, I can't think of one. And there'll be reasons for that. And the reason will be because in early childhood, when this stuff happens, the very mechanism that's getting engaged, the fight-flight mechanism, is one that goes, we could die from this. And in the dependent stage of childhood, that's absolutely true. Without the parents, the child can't live. What you're going to notice in the client is a sense of overwhelm. So you really want to have this focus on looking for any word that sounds like a sense of overwhelm. I just can't. I get, something comes over me. I can't, and you'll just hear things that are, and you'll be looking with your magnifying glass for signals of overwhelm. It's just too much. So that's child mechanism. Internal criticism, internal override. Experience later on as the person coming in and going, I don't know why, I just wake up in the morning and there's this thing in my head telling me I'm not successful enough, I'm not brainy enough, I haven't done enough in my life, it's just not good enough. Which of course is inner criticism, that's what they're going to come with. And you're going to help them understand where that came from the point of view of training. You're going to help them notice that it's not sensitive, what's going on inside. It's not what they would want for anyone that they love. And then you're going to get them to follow that. So that's child mechanism, internal override. We experience as inner criticism. So important because it's the one that all of the other ones are going to come back to. But let's go one step ahead. The child is now as big as the parent, adolescent, as loud as the parent, not feeling quite as dependent as they were before. And so, what started off as shit in, shit further in adolescence becomes shit out. So instead of internally overriding and don't make too much noise, when the parent of the adolescent says, don't make too much noise, funnily enough, exactly what the adolescent was trained with in childhood when there was a huge power dynamic differential, child's this big, parent's that big, is now in the back room of the child that's now become the adolescent. Now, it's like, no, don't tell me not to make any noise. You stop making any noise. Screw you. And this is, of course, acting out, and it's external override. Oh, I'm going to intimidate you into change, whether it's verbally or physically. And it's the simplest of the mechanisms because it's very direct. It's just, no, not doing it. And that's that stage. So once again, think of some inner criticisms that you have, maybe 3 or half a dozen, write them down. Think of 3 or half a dozen times that you've acted out. Some people act out all the time. Some people need to be really pushed before they act out. And it isn't always necessarily direct. Like my favorite indirect acting out is a woman who sent out her little boy in the old days when the milkman used to have a little cart and they used to go in the middle of the road and deliver the milk. And he went out and for some reason, maybe didn't do the right thing as far as the milkman was concerned. Maybe the milkman was having a bad day And maybe the money fell out of the bottle or something, and it was all a bit messy, and the milkman was in a hurry, and the milkman shouted at this mother's little child. And this was a real mama bear. Don't mess with my kid. But not at all direct. Not the sort of person who's going to go, how dare you do that? In an acting out adolescent way. Adolescent mechanism to adolescent mechanism. Acting out to acting out. No, 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 no. This was someone who would never do something like that. So all she did was notice what was going on, notice that he was going to deliver the milk with this little, I think it was either electric cart or a little motor cart. Anyway, as soon as he'd gone off to deliver the milk, she just walked up, took the keys out of the cart, and as she was walking back, just dropped them down the drain. Very much acting out, very indirect. So don't be fooled by action, inaction, abuse, neglect, visible, invisible. They're two sides of the same coin. There's still the intention to get some compliance, which is don't mess with my kid again. So, adolescent mechanism, external override, don't tell me what to do, acting out. Now, when you become an adult, you can think longer term. And that ability to think longer term, as we notice adolescents have a tendency not to think so long term, which is why it's a really good period of life where you're not having to think about all that stuff, but of course parents and adults have a lot of difficulty with that. So what happens is, when, whatever stage that happens, whatever age that happens, that the person becomes an adult, and they've got longer term plans like marriage and mortgage and status and stability, then there's a sense of, right, this is what we need to do, and we need this and that and the other. So what happens when the boss says, well, we'd like you to come in on Sunday morning at 4 a.m, there's a part that's an adolescent part that wants to go, are you serious? I don't want to come in. No way. But there's an adult part now that's going, but we need the money. We want the career. So that part says, don't tell them to get nicked. And so what you get is a part that goes, yes, of course I'll come in at 4 o'clock in the morning. I'd love to. And underneath it is. And of course that's what we're calling the override of adolescent mechanism, which we know as passive aggression. So while I'm describing these, think of 3, 4, 5, 6 examples where you've been very upset about something, but you didn't say anything about it. Now, when you've got child, adolescent, adult, 3 layers of override, someone's not a happy camper. That's a lot of sucking shit. So, what inevitably has to happen a need to not feel that sense of overwhelm. A need, when the feelings start coming down the path, a combination of adolescent and adult will find whatever they can, sex, drugs, rock and roll, screens, gymaholism, clean, it doesn't matter whether it's over-the-counter stuff or under-the-counter stuff, whether it's self-distraction or self-medication. You're not going to die from them. They just feel overwhelming. That's why we're calling it addiction. Now, while we're on this, important to understand that the extension of self-distraction, self-medication, is when that's been tried, usually for a long period of time, to try to keep this sense of overwhelm, these feelings at bay. And over time, no amount of drugs and alcohol or self-distraction or workaholism does it. So then what happens is what I call an internal euthanasia. Parts go, look, we've got this seemingly life-threatening way of being that's happening, that's constantly overwhelming us. We're in agony. I want to put in brackets here that the agony is the inability to grieve. And what we're going to show is how to have a healthy relationship to grieving, and that basically these parts are trying to eventually say, look, the best thing is to put you out of your misery. And the way to do that is to pull the plug on the body. When all you need to do is be able to grieve what you can't change in life, that's a waste of a life, not necessary. But that has to be understood. So that's the extension. These are the 4 mechanisms. Next, we're going to be looking at how to work with them. So, while I've been going through the 4 mechanisms, you may or may not have thought of your own examples of inner criticism, acting out, passive aggression, or addiction. Now would be the time to think of 1, 2, or 3 examples of each of those, because we're going to use them to get clarity on how that operates within us, not in an abstract way, in a very practical way, and then take it even one step further to, and how would you work with that? And that'll be taking us up to the end of this module.